Hello, my name is Dr. Julie Norstrand. Through my work consulting with families and about planning for caregiving, as well as through the support groups that I run, I've come to realize that caregiving is a very emotional journey, both rewarding and challenging. The rewarding aspects can come from the time spent together with the loved one, as learning more about who they were in terms of their history, as well as who they are today. It can also be an opportunity for making amends and clarifying misunderstandings that may have existed for years. But there are also many challenges that caregivers experience, and it is these challenges that I'm going to focus on today. I think it's both important and helpful for people who take on this role to be aware of possible challenges so they may be better prepared for how to deal with them. So on this slide here, you see different emotional challenges that many caregivers describe. I want you to take just a minute or two and just look at these different descriptions and think to yourself, which ones of these might you recognize in yourself? I've heard from a lot of caregivers express these emotions over the years. Some time ago, a caregiver wrote to me about how he was coping. He is someone who was caring for his wife with Alzheimer's. And what he wrote to me was frustration, anxiety, anger, sleep deprivation, restricted activities, separation from friends. This really gives you an insight how it might be for someone who is caring for an older loved one, especially if you're caring all by yourself, and often for caregivers caring for a person with dementia, that can be very challenging. So when it comes to understanding these emotions, it is important to realize that many of these emotions come together. So just case in point, a few weeks ago I was running a caregiver support group where we were talking about how to maintain your level of patience as a caregiver. And what many of the caregivers instead described was that they felt that they couldn't maintain their level of patience, and that this automatically made them feel frustrated and also a sense of feeling guilty. It's also important to realize that many of these experiences come at different stages of caregiving. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, if you are the sole caregiver, these emotions can be that much stronger, because it is that much more challenging to be caring on your own. So for the remainder of our time, what I want to be focusing on is, first, what does it mean to be a caregiver? Then I'm going to talk about the caregiver stress syndrome, what the signs and symptoms are, and the impact on health. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about emotional stresses. And I want you to really to think about what are your stresses. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to manage stress, what you can do. And then finally, I'll talk about the services and resources available for caregivers, where you might be able to get them, and the costs. So one of the challenges in this line of work, trying to help caregivers, is that often people don't define themselves as a caregiver. And this is especially true in the early stages of caregiving, where instead you might see yourself as the dutiful son or dutiful daughter. You're doing some food shopping, you might be fixing a loose doorknob, you might be reminding them of the next week's doctor's appointment. But eventually you're more than the dutiful son or daughter. You become the one that your parent or loved one relies on. In other words, you're their caregiver. It's this reliance which is so critical in this relationship. And often this comes with challenges, stress, and time taken away from other responsibilities, including work, family, and social life. Again, think a little bit about where do you put yourself. The mere fact that you're listening to this session, I imagine that you're probably someone who is taking on the role of a caregiver. However, you may not be seeing yourself quite as a caregiver yet, or you may be very much in the thick of it and fully identify with yourself as the caregiver. A huge issue for caregivers is what is known as caregiver stress syndrome, also known as burnout. There is one caregiver that truly exemplifies this for me, who I'll never forget. This was in the early stage of the pandemic, and it was in an early evening around 7:30 in the evening, and I got a call from someone, didn't recognize the number. It wasn't someone I knew. Turned out that afterwards that she had got my number through the Acton Council on Aging. And she was someone who was caring for her two parents, both aged 91. She was the sole caregiver. The siblings were not available, and she was burning through her own retirement funds. And the parents were very recluse and would not let anyone else take care of them. And she hadn't slept in days. She clearly was exhibiting burnout and experiencing multiple stresses. And that conversation at the end, she thanked me profusely for listening to her. And it was such an insight into how people in her situation, often having a listening ear, an empathetic listening ear, can be quite impactful. The way that caregiver stress syndrome can manifest itself can be seen in terms of extreme exhaustion, and is often demonstrated physically, mentally, emotionally, as well as socially. And on this slide here, you see the typical ways that burnout can manifest itself. So again, take a look at these different descriptions. And you'll notice that some of them fall under more physical signs, such as, for example, change in appetite or weight. Some are more along the emotional signs, such as irritability or sadness. And then you'll see some that are more along the social realm, such as staying away from friends, isolating yourself, and stopping things that you enjoy doing. So again, what I want you to do is to think a little bit about these different signs and symptoms and see whether are there any that you might recognize in yourself, and which ones might they be. So as you can imagine, the more stressed out that you are as the caregiver, the greater the toll on your health. And on this slide, you see various negative health outcomes associated with stress. And these are studies that have done meta-analyses. So basically a combination of a whole lot of studies on health and stress amongst caregivers. And overall, these studies will indicate that roughly about 40 to 70% of caregivers will experience some depression. 45% of caregivers will report chronic conditions such as heart attacks, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis. And then, at least for me, a very striking one is a study that found that caregivers aged 66 to 96 have 63% higher mortality rate than non-caregivers of the same age. So if you're asking yourself why you should be concerned about stress. I think these figures clearly spell it out. So again, you're here today because you're probably realizing that there is some level of challenge, emotional challenge that you may be experiencing as a caregiver. And this page here has some 3 basic questions, which again is something that you can reflect on later on in your own time. The first question is, how worried or anxious are you about expecting to become or being a caregiver, with 0 being the least and 100 being the most? The second question is, what is causing your anxiety? And I think a helpful way of getting you going is just simply write statements such as, I am worried about, and then fill it out. And then the final question is, what are you doing to relieve your stress? In order to de-stress, and then fill it out. I think it's a helpful exercise to try and get a sense of where you are at. Just one thing that I want to point out is I've done various surveys with caregivers. One of them included these questions, and on a fairly small sample size, only about 50 or so caregivers. These were caregivers who are either about to become a caregiver or were currently a caregiver. And on average, people reported feeling at a stress level of about 60. So when you think about what stress can do for you in terms of your health, that's a worrisome number, I would say. But again, I think it would be an interesting exercise for you to do this in your own time. So here on this slide, you have many of the stresses that caregivers report. Some of them reflect more early on stress. For example, not knowing where to start or how to start. Not knowing the information, where to get reliable information. Not knowing how to initiate that conversation. I've had so many people who have said to me, just as I was saying, they didn't know where they could get reliable information on the internet. And also, they felt such a barrier when it came to getting that conversation started, not only just with their loved one, but also with other family members. Also, caregiver stress about how they manage every day, especially if they have children and are working, is a huge area. What I'm referring to is work-life imbalance. Ultimately, these caregivers will talk about feeling like they're being pulled in so many different directions at the same time. Another area is self-doubt. For many, if they are suddenly having to manage chronic health conditions along with the typical caregiving duties such as food shopping, taking your loved one to a doctor's appointment, doing the bills and taxes, preparing meals, and so on. This can be pretty daunting when you're suddenly having to take on perhaps more medical responsibilities. Recently, I consulted with a family. It was 2 brothers and a sister. The sister in this call, it became very evident extremely quickly that she was extremely anxious. And when I learned more about what her situation was like, it was very understandable. She was the one who was going to be caring for the mom. She was living with her mom. The mom had come home from a car accident and had multiple issues going on, which required quite a lot of medical attention. And this daughter had never done any of these types of tasks before. So she was worried about that, and also she was worried about just a simple concern around, what if my mom falls on the floor, will I be strong enough to pick her up? Will I be able to take her to the bathroom in the middle of the night? So I don't think it takes too much to understand why this was so scary for her. She clearly had a lot of self-doubt. However, as often with many things in life, once we start to do it and we start to realize we are able to do it, we then calm down. I was able to check up on the family for weeks thereafter and was able to determine that she started to gain confidence and realized that she was able to take on this role. Another area is lack of support, and this is probably the biggest chronic scenario that results in caregiver burnout. There are too many families out there who are doing the caregiving on their own. In other words, the sole caregiver. The monotony of caring can be pretty grinding. Unlike with children, where you generally see continued growth, especially with healthy children. Instead, when you're caring for someone who is older, you're seeing increased frailty and possibly cognitive impairment. And that can be certainly very demoralizing. Unfortunately, the lack of support for that sole caregiver is a reflection on the way that the families are today. In other words, we have fewer children, we live further apart. And therefore, the burden of care can often fall on that one individual. Another area of stress is general family conflicts that can occur due to disagreements about how the care should be done. Who should be providing more support beyond the primary caregiver? What the care recipient wants, or what is in their best interest. For example, I've had siblings who will argue amongst themselves about that now is time to put mom or dad in an assisted living, whereas others are saying, absolutely not, they're totally fine where they are, you'll break their heart if you move them. And finally, of course, a major stressor is around the financial cost of long-term care. As I mentioned a while ago, in a previous recording, I mentioned the fact that on average, caregivers will spend about a quarter of their income, which is pretty significant when you think about it. For many families who are already financially struggling, then to have having to pay for cost of care for someone else can really become incredibly stressful. So the question ultimately becomes, what can you do to manage your stress? Here on this slide, you have a whole array of different types of activities or actions that you might consider. I'm sure that you know a lot of these, but it still is, it behooves you to really think through each one of them and make sure that you have tried it out. Figuring out what works for you is very individualized. For some people, yelling it out can be very good at de-stressing you. For others, they want quiet time, they want a confidant to speak with. For others, following a good exercise diet can have good impact on them. I always say to people who say, well, you know, I know that I need to take care of myself as a caregiver. I'm really going to make sure that I do a better job with my diet. I always say to people, start slow. If you're going to try and change your diet overnight, it may be doomed for failure. So be kind to yourself in terms of how you're going to try and help yourself. The last one here is a really important one, and that is caregiver support groups. I myself run several through various senior centers and councils on aging. The reason why caregiver supports are so fantastic for managing people's stress is that it gives you the opportunity as the caregiver to truly speak about how you're doing and to really be honest. Just last evening, I had a caregiver support group through the Newton Senior Centre. And one of the caregivers mentioned how she was feeling that she was angry about being a caregiver. And she felt guilty for feeling this anger. And instead of it being just silence, all the others in the group were also saying, I feel the same. And just by that sharing of that emotion enabled her to realize firstly that she wasn't alone in that feeling, but it also probably made her feel less guilty. So these caregiver support groups give you the opportunity to really voice how you're feeling. And also many of them are wonderful in terms of sharing tips and recommendations about how you might work through a problem or an issue in terms of how to better manage someone that you're caring for. So if you've never tried a caregiver support group, I would really recommend it. But of course I realize that, as I said, we're all very different. Some of us would much prefer to speak to a close friend or possibly talk to a therapist on a one-to-one basis. Here on this page, you see, or this slide, you see specific ways of managing stress. This was taken from Springwell. Springwell is another aging service access point that serves the Newton area. In my last presentation, I mentioned that the Minuteman is the aging service access point that serves the Littleton area. But anyway, you could possibly take a look at these different ways of managing your stress and see if maybe they work for you. So to end this presentation, I want to make sure that you really know about the community-based services and resources that are available for caregivers. Because the key point is that you want to make sure that you make use of them so that you can give yourself a break, you can give yourself respite. Remember, it is so important that you listen to your own needs, because if you burn out, you're not going to be able to provide the optimal care for your loved one. Now, these types of respite services can fall under either in-home services or out-of-the-home services. And they can be arranged either for a few hours in the afternoon, for several days or weeks. It really is up to what your needs are. So looking first at the in-home care services, these are the ones within the home. And you have, for example, medicalized support people such as home health aides. You have non-medical home care or personal care assistants. And then you also have companionship. And you may think a little bit, well, is it really worth it to get just what is called a companion? Yes, it is. The reason being is we really learned through COVID the detrimental impact that isolation and loneliness can have on the individual. So if you really feel that your loved one is being stimulated, that they're having conversations with the carer, then you can really feel that they're being taken care of, and it can give you really that sense of like, okay, I'm doing the best that I can, now I'm able to step away, take a bit of a break. The other thing to know about, and I find that a lot of people aren't aware of these, especially early on in the caregiving world, and that is adult day centers. These are centers, you could argue, a little bit like a child care center, but for older adults, obviously. They the goal is to provide a safe, comfortable place that gives them stimulation, activities. These places will also often provide a light meal in the morning, a lunch, and a light meal in the afternoon. And there are different types of adult day centers. There's the adult day social care, and that's for adults who are more independent. You have the adult day health care, which is for adults where they are starting to need some support, maybe, for example, going to the restroom or feeding. And then you have adult day dementia care, and that is for people who have significant memory issues. The final one to know about is nursing facilities. These you can arrange for your loved one to go and stay for a week, maybe 2, if let's say that you're trying to arrange for a holiday and you want to be able to go away somewhere for more than just a day or 2. So again, please, it's so important that you know about these services and that you also make use of them. You need to, as I said, you need to take care of yourself in order to be able to take care of others. One thing that I found is that people have often come to me and said, I'm at a point now where I realize, I do need more support. I need someone to come in and provide support within the home. And then they will say that their experience of hiring an aide has not gone well for them. And I think often that may be because they haven't given enough thought about the specific questions that they need to ask when interviewing for an aide. So just a little cheat sheet here to give you a sense of how you might go about this. First 2 areas to think about is, who is the client? In other words, your loved one, who are they in terms of their personality, their interests, their needs, and so on. And another thing to think about is, you're going to be basically hiring someone to support you. So you also need to think a little bit about what kind of person do you work best with? Do you want an aide to come in who asks you for every step of the way what they should and should not do and check in with you all the time? Or are you better with an aide who can you can give them sort of general instructions and then they can figure it out themselves and they don't need to come running to you all the time? Some of us prefer, either the very sort of micromanaging way of the relationship with the aide. Others of us are much more hands-off. But here are some good questions to reflect on in terms of when hiring a new aide. I'm not going to read through these, but you can certainly take a look at these in your own time. And then finally, going back to that sort of emotional support for caregivers, I'm going to stress it again. It is important that you care for yourself. And on this slide here, there is a whole array of different avenues that you might consider for reaching out for help. The typical ones being family, friends, and neighbors, maybe a spiritual group, or a religious entity, and again, the caregiver support group. What I find is that people will sometimes say to me, the adult child, let's say, will say, oh, I have people coming to me and saying, oh, how can I help you? Let me know if I can be of any help. And there I always say, you should have in the back of your mind a concrete list of things where you feel that you could comfortably ask that person to provide some help, rather than just say, oh, thank you so much, I'll get back to you, because inevitably it'll never happen. And remember, the person who's reaching out to you is being very genuine, they really mean it, but they can't see exactly what your day-to-day routine is like. So they don't really know exactly where you need help. So you have to really spell it out to them. And people are going to want to help. It's in human nature, but they just need to be guided in terms of how to provide the best help to you. Very last thing is, here are some resources for caregivers that you may want to look into on the internet. Take a look through these different, you can do a search by these different keywords, and you should be able to get a whole host of information that can be reliable and provide you with support. I hope that as I've gone through these slides, you may not be feeling quite as relaxed as this frog here, but at least I do hope that I have eased your worry a little bit. Thank you so much.